Tonight, the information war rages in the Middle East. After last night's explosion at a hospital in Gaza, the Hamas-run Palestinian Health Ministry says 471 people were killed. Israel says Palestinian Islamic jihadis were behind it. Back here in Westminster, Rishi Sunak is urged by more than 40 MPs to push for a ceasefire. His trip to the region is expected to be imminent. And we'll be looking ahead to tomorrow's twin by-elections as 2 seats are potentially up for grabs to replace 2 departing Conservative MPs. All that and more with Layla Moran and Sama Shah, who are here to give their take for the next hour. It's Wednesday, I'm Sophy Ridge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Well, before we went on air last night, there were reports of mass casualties at a hospital in Gaza. The Palestinian health authorities said that at least 500 people died at the Al Ahli hospital. We reported that and attributed the claim to them. But who is the Gaza Health Ministry? Well, it's Hamas-run. 24 hours on, Israel says it wasn't them. US officials say the intelligence gathered so far indicates that Israel is not responsible. And the UK government, well, they're saying that they're still working to establish the facts and that too many people jump to conclusions too quickly. The reality is we're in a brutal, bloody and physical war, but it's also a war of information. Let's get a roundup, shall we, of where we are tonight. Here's our correspondent, Tom Palmerton.
With thousands already dead and the Middle East in turmoil, President Biden landed in Tel Aviv to embrace friends, but with a mission to try and find conciliation in this crisis. It is perhaps the biggest diplomatic test of his presidency. The dispute over who hit the Ali Arab hospital in northern Gaza is clouded by the fog of war. The Palestinian authorities are adamant it was an Israeli airstrike. The Israel Defense Forces have said it was not them.
Based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. But there's a lot of people out there who are not sure.
What is not in doubt is the effect of what happened.
There were more than 3,000 people here for whom this place was a safe haven. During our shift, without any warning, and at around 6:30 p.m., a shell struck the hospital. We don't know what it was, but we saw its devastating impact, with children being torn to pieces.
The Palestinian Health Ministry said 471 people were killed here. Over 300 others were injured. The hospital strike prompted street protests and anger across the Middle East. In Lebanon, the militant group Hezbollah called for a day of rage against the enemy.
Colleagues, whoever want to say something can. When I'm done, we will take questions. If you direct the questions to me, I will either answer it or designate to someone, or you may choose a senator to ask questions to. So with that, I will open by telling you that the people of Israel have suffered a terrorist attack that many are equating to our own September 11th. Mass gunmen, entire families in their homes, massacred babies and the elderly, and dragged hostages across the border into Gaza. We saw a lot of it in the film, on TV, and otherwise. These attacks are
behind their civilians, embedding themselves in the civilian population and using them as human shields.
In his final address, President Biden reiterated his unwavering support for Israel, but urged them to stay within the rules.
What sets us apart from the terrorists is we believe in the fundamental dignity of every human life. Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, Jew, Muslim, Christian, everyone.
This difficult trip has made a difference. He promised that the closed border crossing from Egypt into Gaza will soon open. Israel said it will happen, as long as it's only food, water and medicine for the civilian population. The Americans are also sending $100 million worth of aid into Gaza and the West Bank. It is desperately needed. Tom Parmenter, Sky News.
We're back here today in Westminster at Prime Minister's questions on the issue of that hospital explosion in Gaza. Rishi Sunak was careful to say that we shouldn't rush to judgment before we have all the facts. He also repeated the statement that he's been saying since the beginning of the conflict, that Israel has a right to defend itself, and said the Israeli army operates in accordance with international law. Well, our political editor, Beth Rippey, is here with us. And Beth, it's difficult, isn't it, for the UK to know how to respond on these big international events? And what is the message from the Prime Minister?
Well, I think what we saw at Prime Minister's questions today was that the message from the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition was one of unity, and that was repeated not uniformly but broadly across the House of Commons. And where has the UK political class, if you like, got to on this? One, that Israel has a right to protect itself and Hamas is to blame for the atrocities, not the Palestinian people. That humanitarian aid needs to be moved into Gaza, and there's a big international effort for that to happen. And of course, all leaders talking about the prevention of further escalation in this growing into a regional conflict and spreading out beyond the Israel-Hamas war. And to that end, I think there's a few things happening. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, announcing in the Commons today that he is going to the region. He will visit Egypt, Qatar and Turkey. We also expect that the Prime Minister will follow and will also go to the region. And that comes on the visit of President Biden. And the UK government have stressed that in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attack on Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu described the US and UK as the two countries in the front line of support. So I think what we're seeing is there is a unified position of the main political parties at a time when there is deep concern about the way that this could escalate, as well as the civilian casualties, and a genuine effort to try not to stoke division and try and seek solutions.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that kind of unity between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition, at least. Where are we up to when it comes to the explosion at the hospital, the one that we were reporting on yesterday's show?
Well, in terms of the explosion around the hospital, President Biden has said earlier today that it looks like it was the other team, to quote him verbatim. That's not quite where the UK government is in what they are publicly saying. It was remarked on in the Commons by the Prime Minister, then by the Foreign Secretary. And I think we have a clip of the Prime Minister speaking about that later this afternoon, which I think we can listen to.
Israel has the right to defend itself against what has been an appalling, barbaric act of terrorism by Hamas, and they need to make sure that they can keep their citizens safe. That's the duty of government. People would expect nothing less from me and the government if something like this happened here. But it's also important that they operate in accordance with international law, and indeed the President of Israel has said that their military forces will indeed do that. Now, this is obviously made more complicated by the fact that Hamas, the terrorist organisation, embeds itself inside of civilian populations, but we have urged Israel to take every possible precaution to avoid harming civilians.
So there's a bit of a difference between Rishi Sunak and Joe Biden and what they're saying.
What you heard the Prime Minister say there was quite pointedly that we know Hamas embeds itself in the civilian population, but what the government haven't yet done is publicly say that it wasn't Israel responsible for the attack, which is what Hamas are arguing. That's different from where President Biden is, but you know, you will listen to what James Cleverly said in the Commons, and he said we will not rush to judgment. When I talk to people behind the scenes that are working on this and what to announce when, there was a definite view of this should not be read as a divergence between the US and the UK, that this is rather a timing issue about what President Biden feels comfortable to say, as opposed to the UK government, because the UK government will want their security services to actively look at the significant detail that's been provided by Israel, and then, when satisfied, will make their decision public. So I think it's more a timing issue here than two allies diverging in where they will say responsibility lies.
You can see the caution, can't you, coming from everywhere when it comes to the British government. I just want to talk to you, if I may, about Labour as well. Because as we were saying, I mean, Keir Starmer has effectively been echoing the sentiments of Rishi Sunak that Israel has a right to defend itself. It feels like there's a little bit of discomfort starting to bubble away now among some aspects of the Labour Party.
Yeah, and we were both at conference and we were commenting, weren't we, about this incredible show of unity around the Labour Party over this issue. And I think that Keir Starmer has kind of two levels here that he's working on. He is trying to be a Prime Minister in waiting. He is trying to be statesmanlike, and he is trying to talk to the country. But there is another conversation going on in the Labour movement with divisions over what is happening and how the leader frames it. And someone that was at party conference that's been involved in some of the discussions behind closed doors put it to me like that at party conference, Labour handled it well. This is what they said. You know, we left the bubble. And like all progressive parties over the world have the same problems of differences in opinion on this issue. This person said there's a disconnect between the Labour family and wider population, where people do not have strong views in the wider population on Israel and Palestine and find it actually very complicated to understand, whereas in the Labour movement, people do have very strong views on this. So this becomes, to quote this person, a handling exercise and a test of the Labour leadership. But let's listen to what Keir Starmer's tone was in the House of Commons earlier today, Sophie.
Mr. Speaker, the news last night of hundreds killed at the Baptist Hospital in Gaza is incredibly distressing. But it's much worse for the people of Gaza. Their fear that there's no place of safety is profound. International law must be upheld, and that means hospitals and civilian lives must be protected.
Beth, we have been expecting Rishi Sunak to be visiting Israel. I think we obviously saw the risks associated with that, with the blast that went off on the eve of Joe Biden's visit. Do we know anything more about that?
Well, I mean, what we saw overnight was literally as Joe Biden was flying over and he had meetings arranged, that those meetings, some of them were cancelled in the light of this blast and the fallout of that politically for this diplomatic dash that he was making. So the first thing I would say is that any leader going to the region at the moment, it's a high-risk strategy. The situation is febrile, it's fluid, it's changing. But I think also what you're seeing is incredible backdoor, sort of behind-the-scenes diplomacy by the Secretary of State and then by the US President. And the UK Prime Minister, I think, feels that he too has a role to play. If he does go, and as I said, we are expecting him to go, it will be about humanitarian aid and about how the UK can play a role, as the US has done in trying to prevent wider escalation. I think also he will be there to try and represent British citizens and get people out and you know, find out what's happened to those missing British citizens as well.
Yeah, an awful lot of such delicate diplomacy going on behind the scenes. Thank you very much, Beth Ruby, there, our political editor. Well, let's get a bit more now, shall we, on those tensions in the Middle East. Anger flaring across the region after the Gaza hospital blast. Protests have erupted in Beirut, Lebanon and Amman, and protesters attempted to storm the Israeli embassy in the Jordanian capital. And the information war of claim and counterclaim rages alongside the killings in the actual war. Well, our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is in Ashkelon in southern Israel. Deborah, what's the latest that we know about what happened?
Well, like you say, it is an information war as much as it is a very physical war, and both sides know just how important it is to try to control the narrative. And the thing is, when this horrendous explosion happened yesterday evening at the hospital in Gaza, Hamas was very quick to come out and accuse Israel of launching an airstrike at the site. It didn't have any specific evidence to back that up, but it comes after days of Israeli bombardments across the Strip. And so that claim was then picked up and triggered outrage, particularly in the Arab world, and protests that you've just been talking about. Now, for Israel, it also moved relatively quickly to counter this allegation, but it did so with evidence that it said backed up its claim. So at 1 o'clock this morning, a senior Israel Defense Forces spokesperson went on a video call with journalists to say that the initial analysis by the Israeli military was that none of its jets, its ships, its artillery were firing at that location at that time. By contrast, he then said that Israeli radar imagery had captured the traces of a Islamic Jihad barrage of rockets launched near the hospital, and he claimed that one of them had misfired and landed on that site. And he then produced what he said was Israeli drone footage. He said that a UAV, an Israeli unmanned aircraft, had been moved over the site to capture imagery and see what was on the ground. And that's probably the most compelling picture in terms of supporting what the Israelis are saying. And it plays out with the images that we've also seen today in terms of the blast site. Independent analysts have said that the actual damage that's being created is not the size of crater that you would expect had it been ammunition fired from an aircraft. Instead, it does really match this idea that it might have been a misfired rocket. And the Israelis had another press conference today where they presented again all this evidence, and they also released what they claimed to be intercepted communications by Islamist militants, apparently expressing surprise that a rocket from their own side had landed on this site. Now, of course, this is impossible for us to independently verify, but again, it all feeds into this information space.
Yeah, it certainly does. The other thing it feels that so many politicians are worried about is other nations, other areas getting dragged into this conflict, the anger spreading, if you like. It does feel like there is mounting anger. We've seen protests across the region.
Yes, so there have been huge protests. You talked about some of them. Our colleague, in fact, Alex Rossi and his team, they were witnessing some of the protests in Beirut, particularly outside the US embassy there. These protests do seem to have been amplified by this attack, this explosion on the hospital last night, but it comes on top of growing anger at the civilian death toll in Gaza from Israeli bombardments over the past number of days. It's a very volatile situation, and that's why you've got the US president visiting here today and British officials too, very much focused on trying to contain the crisis to this country and not wanting other regional actors to get involved.
Deborah, thank you very much indeed. Deborah Haynes there reporting for us. Well, the war is sure to feature heavily in tomorrow's newspapers. We're going to have our extended press preview and news review. That's from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Well, joining us will be the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire, and the Daily Mail columnist, Amanda Platel. We can pick up now with our guest this evening, Liberal Democrat Foreign Affairs spokesperson, the UK's first MP of Palestinian descent, Layla Moran, and the former Conservative Special Advisor, Salma Shah. Thank you both for being with us. Thank you for being with us, I want to say, because it is a brutal and a draining story to cover. I mean, Layla, not least when you know people, you have relatives, you have friends and family in the region. So, thank you for coming on and for sharing that. What are you hearing about the situation in Gaza?
I mean, the situation across the region, I've got family in Jerusalem, in Ramallah, Jericho, extended family in Gaza, but also Amman. It is absolutely right to say that it is mournful, sorrowful, fearful, and a profound sense of loss, a little bit of abandonment, I think, because of the stance that Western leaders have taken, which have been so stridently pro-Netanyahu. And, you know, later on, we started to hear international humanitarian law, and it came later. I've yet to hear, for example, a very clear statement of condolence and sorrow for the Palestinian people without in any way mentioning Hamas or whatever else, just on its own. That has not happened from, for example, Rishi Sunak, and it would go a long, long way. So I think what they are worried about is what's going to happen over the next few days. The sad fact of the matter is we've all been here before, maybe not quite to this scale, but we remember the Intifada, we remember other skirmishes. This is now 3 generations of hurts and it looks like it's happening again. And what we all want somehow when we get through the next few days, weeks, whatever, this time, we want a clear signal that it's not just, oh, 2 states, yes, that's where we want to get to, but a real concerted effort from the West to not abandon the region again.
What's the situation like in Gaza in terms of people's day-to-day lives right now? You know, are people trying to get out and being able to? Are people struggling to go? You know, can you go to your local shop and pick things up? I know this sounds really ridiculous, but what is it actually like?
Yeah. So what we're hearing is, you know, massive queues for, you know, single loaves of bread. People are starting to run out of clean water, and our dirty drinking water, as we know, is a public health crisis. And it's worth pointing out the situation in Gaza before this was pretty dire. You know, it's essentially an open prison. You can't get in or out. You have to have special work permits in order to get out and make some money. That changes over time depending on what the Israeli government decides it will allow. These were poor people to begin with. And we are now in a situation where Israel has decided to cut off the electricity, cut off the water. And that's a choice that they've made. They are doing it because they want the hostages to be released. And of course, the hostages need to be released. I think everyone is absolutely unanimous about that. What pains me, and I visited the region this time last year, and I met with many peace activists who are Israeli, who are now hostages. I mean, the irony and the awfulness of that situation. But the Palestinian people, if people say they are not Hamas and they shouldn't be punished for what Hamas has done, they should be pressuring the Israeli government not just to let aid in through the Rafah bridge from Egypt, but actually to turn the water back on. That is something they could also do, and I would wish that was one of the calls that was being made.
What do you make, Somber, of the UK government's response to this? Do you think that they've got it about right?
I think this is a very difficult situation because it's fast-moving. So you've already seen that President Biden's gone in, offered $100 million of aid for Palestinians in Gaza and opened up humanitarian corridors, one, admittedly, but is attempting to apply that pressure on Israel to respond proportionately is the word that everybody's throwing around at the moment. It has to do so in coordination with its international allies, the UK being foremost in that list. I think for the UK, now that President Biden is going, having not spoken to as many regional actors as he perhaps wanted, the UK now needs to be very careful if it is going to attempt to de-escalate this situation and prevent the contamination of these riots and this unsettling from going into neighbouring countries. I mean, you've already seen, your reports, brilliantly have shown what is happening in neighbouring countries and how the emotion is so incredibly high and the situation is so febrile that it could spread at any moment. So this is a really careful, tactical game that the UK government now needs to play. It is about choreography, it's about coordination. And in this kind of circumstance and situation, that is not always going to be clear, it is not always going to be well executed, so the stakes couldn't be higher.
Yeah, incredibly high stakes diplomacy. Layla, we mentioned, we talked about this earlier, but you obviously took part in a TV interview earlier this week with Richard Madeley. It's something that kind of took on a life of its own on social media because he asked you, effectively, if you knew the Hamas attacks, the terror attacks were going to take place before they actually happened. Was there word on the street, I think was the phrase that he used. I mean, it's pretty offensive. What was your reaction to that?
I mean, I think my face at the time looked pretty flummoxed. And look, the conversation as a whole over the 15-minute interview was an important one. We were looking at how we got here, where we go. I didn't feel and don't feel that it came from a place of malice. I think it came, frankly, from a place of perhaps ignorance, perhaps. It reminds us that in this conflict, which is complicated, okay, this is not the slam dunk in a way that Russia-Ukraine was. This has a long history that needs to be understood, and this has an important context in the wider region that also needs to be understood. When we are talking about these things, we need to be very mindful and thoughtful. I have accepted his apology. The main thing, though, is I don't want it to distract from these big issues. And the biggest issue of all, the one that I fear is going to eventually get forgotten, is when we get through this, and hopefully there will be ceasefire, peace. I think we have a long way to go for what it's worth, but we will eventually get there, we always do, that we don't end up in a situation where we then forget, right, it's fallen off the news agenda and we're just not going to solve this crisis. And that's where I think we need to keep our focus.
Do you think it perhaps plays into what some people may feel about people in Gaza, about Palestinians?
I choose to believe not to. That wasn't what it was doing. When I visited the region, Palestinians are, intelligent, creative people who want to prosper, who want to live without fear, who want to live in peace. And that is the Palestinian ideal that I hope we can put forward. And yes, I would rather that wasn't part of the conversation.
Understood. Thank you both very much indeed for talking about. It's a difficult thing for all of us to talk about, but particularly, of course, people who know people in the region as well. Thank you. Still to come on the Politics Hub this evening, we're going to be taking a look at the rate of inflation here in the UK, which is stuck at 6.7% again this month as petrol prices go up, but food prices go down.
This is a very strange atmosphere, this subject of such horrific attack.
On both sides, one has to say that this is just the most awful situation.
We could hear the distant sound of gunfire.
It's a complete stalemate.
This is a war, and it's going to go on for a very long time.
The most important thing is that you do talk to them, because if you leave it up to what they're seeing on social media, they're being exposed to misinformation and disinformation, and we know that there's a lot of new accounts being set up which are designed to kind of spread the misinformation, to confuse people, whether you're a government or an aid agency or a news organisation, to try and understand what's going on is difficult, let alone a child. So it's really important that even if your child hasn't mentioned it to you, you don't know what they've seen or what they've heard or what they're making of it. So it's really important that you actually just check in with them and say, have you heard about this? What are you thinking?
What's your advice to parents on tackling something they perhaps themselves don't understand?
I think to direct them to a trusted source of information. Now, of course, on Sky News, we have our very own FYI, which goes out every weekend, and on Sky News and on Sky Kids. And at First News, we come out every Friday. We curate the content, especially for children. We are avoiding too much distressing detail or imagery. And we've got this week a big 2-page feature explaining the background, which actually is a good thing for adults to read too.
All right.
Just to put it all into context and to make sure that they really do have an understanding of what's going on.
What's terrifying is the random, sporadic nature of these attacks.
One has to say that this is just the most awful situation.
And as the government has said, this is a war, and it's going to go on for a very long time.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Hello, welcome back. Well, as ever, our coverage has been continuing all day long on our digital politics hub, and here it is in physical form here, because ahead of tomorrow's 2 by-elections, if we can have a quick look, I cross my fingers, normally it works. Bear with us.
It's all self-control.
Oh dear. Well, I can just tell you about it anyway. The piece on our digital politics hub that you can find at home, it is talking about a Sky News Daily, where our very own roving reporter, John Craig, talks about the by-election campaigns, because Thursday is going to mark John's... I think I'll find it for you. Here we go. Here he is. This is what we need. John Craig. It's going to mark John's 40th count for Sky News, right? So this is well worth your while. The king of by-elections for Sky News. And we'll have all the details of tomorrow's votes with Sam Coates later in the programme as well. I want to show you another story as well. Here we go. Now, this story, Jill Mortimer, who is the MP for Hartlepool, she's responded to the case of Terence Carney, a man who was killed by an asylum seeker in Hartlepool. Now, she's calling for action to expel people who she says have no right to be here. And finally, we can have a look at our pledge tracker. This is one of my favourite tools because we're keeping tabs on the Prime Minister's 5 pledges. You can see them there. One of them, of course, was to halve inflation, which is the one that we're looking at here. Today's inflation figures show that it is still stubbornly high. This dotted line is his target. It's still well above that. And you can have a little look on our Digital Politics Hub on how he's doing on that, plus the other 4 pledges as well. And of course, if you scan the QR code, you can also catch up with all the latest on the Hub throughout the day. Now, let's get a bit more on inflation. This month, the rate of prices increases stuck at 6.7%. It had been expected to fall slightly, but rising fuel prices kept the figure where it was. Now, this matters, not just because we're all feeling the pinch in our wallets, but because September's figure is used to set the up rates to benefits and pensions. Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, has been analysing the figures.
So the latest inflation data suggests the cost of living crisis is still with us when you look at the rate of inflation. This is just showing you how fast prices are rising on an annual basis. You can see that big increase up into double-digit figures there. We're down there. We're kind of flatlining at that kind of 6.7%. However, the government's target, of course, is to try to halve inflation. Now, where is that line going to go? If you look at the Bank of England's forecast, it is likely to go down faster than that. So basically, the government would meet its target. But even so, there's still a lot of pain for households and a lot of question marks over those forecasts, particularly when you look at the breakdown of what's happening with inflation. This is showing you goods and services, core goods and services and goods prices, so the stuff, physical stuff we're buying, going down quite fast. You can see, actually, well, the inflation rate going down quite fast. But how about services? You know, when you're going out to restaurants and so on, haircuts, that's still really high, and economists are quite worried about that. And there's another thing that's worrying economists as well, which is what's happening with the oil price. Of course, what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, a big part of the story here. We're just going back a few weeks here, and you can see just how much oil prices rose when you had those initial attacks on the 7th of October. And again, have a look here. You can see when there was that hospital explosion, you had oil prices going up further as well. And that's a real metric for what's happening right now. Markets' concern about the current situation in the Middle East. That, of course, could feed into inflation as well, further increasing pressure on many families.
Ed Conway there, digging into all of the data on inflation. Still to come on the Politics Hub. It was a somber PMQs today with Israel and Gaza dominating proceedings. MPs were minded to behave themselves. PMQs Unwrapped is next. welcome back. Well, PMQs is usually a bit of a bear pitch, shouting, jeering, order papers being shaken, but not today, with events in the Middle East and the tragic loss of life in Gaza yesterday. MPs on all sides of the House were aware that it wouldn't exactly be a good look to behave like squabbling children. So no playground politics, but grown-up debate, careful statements, not rushing to judgment over the blast at the hospital in Gaza. Well, our political correspondent, Ali Fortescue, is here. Keep you across PMQs as always. What did you see?
Well, I think let's start with a clip from Sajid Javid, obviously, you know, used to be senior cabinet member. And I think this just sort of sums up the mood in the House, because it wasn't really like anything I've seen before. Let's have a listen.
It shames this whole House that British Jews have been subject to such vile abuse and hatred in recent days. Anti-Semitism and all hate crimes, they fly in the face of British values. And we should not allow events abroad, no matter how horrific they are, to be used to sow seeds of division in our own country.
And Ali, you were over there in the House listening. What was the mood like?
As I say, you know, I haven't really seen anything like that at PMQs before. Obviously, things felt different. You know, normally, recess is over, they're back, it's pretty feisty, pretty combative. But obviously, when the Prime Minister took to the dispatch box, talked about the escalation overnight, the chamber fell silent. And what we saw, what we've seen again and again in the last week, was unity, really, between Labour and the Conservatives. Look at this.
I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al Ali Hospital. Any loss of innocent life is a dreadful tragedy, and everyone will be thinking both of those who have lost their lives and the families that they leave behind. We should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on this awful situation. Every member will know that the words we say here have an impact beyond this House.
We are still mourning the terrorist attack on Israel last week. Jews taken hostage, mutilated, slaughtered. And yesterday I met the families of some of the British hostages held by Hamas. Every minute of every hour of every day, they hope for good news, but fear the worst.
It's a really difficult tone, isn't it? A very sombre tone. Was there anything that felt like, I guess, normal Prime Minister's questions, or was the sombre tone more what we're expecting?
I think there were a few moments that felt slightly more normal on domestic policy. I think what was interesting from Keir Starmer there is he talked about meeting the families. At that stage, maybe he was trying to draw a bit of a division with the Prime Minister who hadn't met hostages' families. Since then, though, we understand Rishi Sunak has met one family. He's planning on meeting more. Also worth mentioning, 2 MPs, one Conservative, one SNP MP, asking Rishi Sunak to urge caution from Israel, and this was Rishi Sunak's response to that.
Mr. Speaker, as a friend, we will always urge Israel to take every possible practical precaution to avoid harming civilians and indeed to act within international law, as their president has said that their armed forces will do, whilst recognising the incredible complexity and difficulty of the situation on the ground. And it does bear repeating, Hamas is a terrorist organisation that embeds themselves inside of civilian populations.
Worth saying that after Prime Minister's questions, we hear from the Prime Minister's spokesperson. They said, and I quote, that it's deeply irresponsible to jump to conclusions over the explosion at the hospital in Gaza last night. And that was a message echoed by Stephen Crabb, former Cabinet Minister.
Would the Prime Minister please make the point again that the way that this conflict is being reported has massive implications for our Jewish community, and that any information coming from Hamas must be treated with a degree of scrutiny and cross-examination that is sadly sometimes lacking.
I also think it's worth us listening to what we heard from Stephen Flynn, the SNP leader in Westminster.
Many of the images emanating from Gaza in recent days will shock us all to the core. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will he join with us on these benches and call for an immediate ceasefire in the region?
It feels as if, party conferences are almost like a different lifetime away when we were talking about all kinds of domestic issues. But I guess there was a couple of flickers of what would be, on a normal time for us, really big news stories.
Definitely. I think the moment where it felt like we were just about getting back to normal PMQs was over HS2. Obviously, this was the big conference announcement for the Conservatives. Ordinarily, you would have had a chamber that absolutely erupted at that moment. And we did hear from a few Conservatives. Here's one of them.
Across the region, it should include the much-needed upgrade to the Penistone line running from Huddersfield through my constituency in Sheffield to Sheffield.
The loudest cheers were when the former SNP MP Lisa Campbell crossed the floor to join the Conservative Party for the very first time, sitting next to Theresa May.
That's fine.
There you go. It was a big moment, that, wasn't it? When you saw the new Conservative MP.
Yeah, and this is the new Labour MP, the seat they won in Rutherglen, Hamilton West, being shake a moment of cross-party unity when Stephen Flynn goes across to shake his hand. Here I want to highlight this, some of the sombre faces on both front benches today. And I think that sort of sums it up, really, because, yes, there were some moments where it felt like we were back to domestic politics, the cut and thrust of PMQs, but overall the mood was totally muted. There really was very little rowdiness, particularly on the front benches. Unsurprisingly, everything has been overshadowed by what was happening in the Middle East.
Ali, thank you very much for keeping us up to date on the latest from Prime Minister's questions. Let's pick up now, shall we, with Layla and Somber. I think it's interesting talking there to Ali about what happened at Prime Minister's questions, because there's been like a kind of remarkable amount of unity between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, at least. You could hardly put a cigarette paper between their responses on this. Is that what you would have expected, do you think?
It's absolutely what I would have expected. I think you find that the rabble usually quietens down when there isn't sort of a political opportunity in it. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the Prime Minister has hold of the international, the intelligence and security services. So they will be exchanging information on what's known as Privy Council rules, things that the leader of the opposition should know. So he will have access to government information that usually is exclusively for the Prime Minister, so they will understand what's happening. But also, it's a question of international standing. And I think we have to show something unified here, not least because of what's happening in the situation abroad, but also there are communities who are going to struggle and suffer. And it's what Sajid Javid, my old boss, was talking about in that first clip that you played, is that sort of importation almost of a conflict on our streets is something that we must resist and create a safe haven for these communities to live and understand that actually we live under the rule of law. It's called British values, or what we call British values, and that they don't have to fear any kind of persecution as a result of it.
We're talking about the unity. It does feel to me that among some Labour MPs, Labour councillors in particular perhaps, there is a feeling that they're not completely happy with the stance that Keir Starmer has taken. What's the Lib Dem position? Do you think that you guys are completely in the same place as Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, or are there any kind of differences that you'd point out?
So we feel and felt earlier on that the emphasis on international humanitarian law was incredibly important. When Ed Davey had his question to the Prime Minister in the original statement when we first came back, we echoed the words of the WHO regarding the forced evacuation of hospitals, which then they said is a potential breach of international humanitarian law. So we stand shoulder to shoulder when it comes to Jewish community in the UK, Israel's right to defend itself within those international humanitarian law rules, but we are also gently critical as well. And it's important, I think, in the name of balance, that if you are going to talk about international humanitarian law, you don't just do so in specific terms for one and not for the other, that you actually call out occasions where it might be that, the Israeli Defence Forces haven't quite got there. And I think one of the things that I'm worried about a little bit in the rhetoric at the moment is how there is, yes, a clear distinction, and there should be a clear distinction between Hamas and the Palestinians, 100%, but an insinuation that it is Hamas themselves causing the 2,600, 3,000 odd deaths now that we're seeing in Gaza. It isn't. It is the carpet bombing from the Israeli Defence Forces.
Although I guess
so there
Israel would say that this is a result of the terror attack by Hamas.
Of course. But I'm just saying that I do think that there needs to be more balance now. There is space for balance now. At the beginning, absolutely right, we stand with the people of Israel, but we also stand with the Palestinians, and there is no issue with being both.
OK, thank you very much indeed for the discussion. Still to come on the Politics Hub, we're going to have lots more on the war, but you could have been forgiven for missing that there are not one but two crunch by-elections happening tomorrow in Mid-Bedfordshire and in Tamworth. Can the Conservatives hold both or either? We'll debate.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News's arts and entertainment correspondent. When you think of Glastonbury, it's mud you want and music. They're going to cross to us live in a minute. Okay. Thank you so much. Brad Pitt is now a prolific producer behind the scenes.
It's not a mystery to me. We always were capable of doing this.
Oh, they're wonderful children as an audience.
Who did that? Maverick here on the red carpet. I'm so excited, Tom Cruise. This is the story of the night.
And it's the little independent film that could.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
Nor have I ever struck any woman in my life.
There's this illusion of power.
Are you feeling well?
I remember covering the Oscars and that now infamous moment, the Will Smith slap. Nobody could quite believe that it had happened. You can tell from these crowds just how excited people are for the return of Pride.
These actors playing the lead roles were born long after the Sex Pistols broke up.
Are you pleased that you did say yes to the job?
I've never regretted it.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
Don't leave me.
Yeah, okay.
There's no easy goodies. There's no easy baddies.
I've had a great time here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hello, welcome back. Well, tomorrow's by-elections in Mid-Bedfordshire and Tamworth haven't exactly dominated the news agenda, hardly surprisingly, but these are important votes and a great deal will be read into whether the Conservatives manage to hold on to those seats. Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates has more. I mean, they'll be feeling pretty nervous right now, right?
They do. I can tell you that nobody can predict what's going to happen. These are the 18th and 19th by-elections in this Parliament. Here they are. One is in Tamworth in Staffordshire, the other is in Mid-Bedfordshire. Lots of similarities, both of them triggered by the resignation of big Boris Johnson allies, both of them rural, small-town seats, and both of them have huge Tory majorities. But why are they in play? Well, look at this. This is the polling situation. Labour leads the Conservatives by 18 percentage points. You can see back when they won that seat over by you, Sophie, December 2019, Tories solidly ahead, but that blue line down there. Now, this implies, now remember this figure, a swing from the Conservatives to Labour of 15%. So that's a pretty big swing already, but is it enough with the two seats?
Well, let's have a look, shall we? The two seats, this is the national polling, but of course, it's what happens in these two places that we'll be keeping an eye on. Mid-Bedfordshire. Nadine Dorries' resignation has triggered this. It requires a 19% swing, so more than the ones that you saw in the polls. Tories got almost 60% of the vote last time round. I mean, this looks like the safest of all safe seats in 2019. When I talk to Tory officials, they think that
amount could come down to as much as 30%. The reason this seat is so hard to call is because Labour and the Lib Dems are fighting it out. Could it be that those two parties fighting together allow the Tories to come up through the middle and actually win? Or, as both the Tories and the Labour Party have been suggesting in recent days, I think it sounds like the Lib Dems have started just targeting the Tories. That could just help Labour a little bit. Nobody knows what's going to happen, nor do they know what's going to happen here in Tamworth. Top Boris Johnson ally Chris Pincher resigned after he lost his appeal against allegations of sexual misconduct. An even bigger majority for the Conservatives there. This is a straight fight between the Labour Party and the Tory Party. Again, Tories expect their vote right down to 30%. This by-election will be decided on turnout. One Labour official worries that actually they haven't put enough effort into this by-election. So again, nobody can quite tell what's going to happen. But what is absolutely clear, Sophie, is that this is the first proper by-election test since the conference season, which could have shaken everything up. Now, the Tories have come out behind in the polls, but what really matters is what the people do at the ballot box.
Yeah, it really does. Big test for the Prime Minister. Sam, thank you very much for talking us through all the data behind those two big battles. Let's pick up, shall we, with Layla and Sam want to talk a little bit more about this. I mean, you look at what happened last time round in 2019 and the bar charts that Sam had, absolutely clear blue water, literally, between the Conservatives and everyone else in those two areas. I mean, if they lose these two seats, there'll be an awful lot of Conservative MPs feeling worried.
I think there are an awful lot of Conservative MPs who are feeling worried at the moment, and this is sort of natural in this part of the election cycle when you're looking at very difficult national polls. I think what's fascinating about both of these seats is that obviously they are, well, not Mid-Bedfordshire, but Tamworth certainly sort of in the fabled red wall. So we're going to have to sort of look at the electoral coalition in some ways that Boris Johnson put together and see where that's going to break and who it's going to break for. So Sam's graph sort of saying, you know, actually there's kind of a little bit of potential tactical voting that could benefit Labour in mid-beds and what's going to happen in the straight fight between Labour and Conservative. All that is really interesting litmus testing for what's going to happen at a general election campaign.
Mid-beds is interesting, right? Because, you know, you have the Conservatives with this majority, if I can get my words out. And yet there's lots of people saying, look, if Labour pulled out for the Lib Dems or if the Lib Dems stopped fighting and let Labour go through, then it would be the way to de-seat the Conservative MP. What would you say to that?
But that's just not how our democracy works, does it? You know, everyone puts up a candidate and we saw mid-beds and we look at, you know, the by-elections that we have won in this Parliament, which have been a good number, where we were also starting from that base with massive Tory majorities, with big rural communities. So, you know, Tiverton and Honiton being a good example, North Shropshire being another. And absolutely, we think we can still, we can win. But I do agree with what Sam was saying earlier. I think it may well just come down to what people decide in those last... Some people say it's the last couple of days. I honestly think for these ones, it could well be the last 10 minutes as they are walking up to that polling station. But absolutely, we think that we can win it.
Right, I'm going to be really mean now. I'm going to ask you both to make a prediction for the two seats. Go on, then.
I think we hold mid-beds and we lose Tamworth.
What do you think?
I have no idea about Tamworth because I haven't been to canvass there. I think we can and will win mid-beds.
Lib Dems going to win mid-beds? OK. Well, not too long till we find out.
We'll find out.
Thank you both for coming on the programme tonight and talking through such a big range of issues. Thank you. We'll have full coverage of both by-elections. Of course, John Craig will be in Mid-Bedfordshire for us. Tamara Cohen will be at Tamworth. That's tomorrow night, right here on Sky News. So big by-election coverage, overnight coverage, and of course into the next day. It's going to have some real consequences for Rishi Sunak if he does lose either of those seats. There'll be a lot of questions asked. But then, of course, if he hangs on, he could perhaps show that he's managing to change the narrative. Remember, if you scan the QR code, you can catch up with all the latest on the Hub throughout the day. Next up, we are going to have Sarah J. Mee with the UK Tonight, and an awful lot more coverage, of course, on the conflict in the Middle East, the war between Israel and Hamas. We'll be back here tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night.